Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session, which is called Bridging the Justice Gap, the Impact of Rural Lawyering. My name is Brooke Meckler, and I'm the director of the Law School Engagement and Advocacy team at Equal Justice Works, and we are so grateful that you are able to join us today to hear from our fantastic panel. If you'd like to enable closed captioning on your screen, please click the closed captioning option at the bottom of your screen now. And if you have questions or comments for our panelists during the session, please type them into the Pathable chat box. Our panelists will answer questions towards the end of the session. So this session will run from 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. Eastern. If you do have to leave at any point, you can always rejoin by clicking on the name of this session under the event agenda. And this will be recorded, so if you're unable to rejoin, you can listen to it at a later date. And we're recording this so that other attendees may also learn from our incredible experts. The recording will not be used for any other purpose. So I am thrilled to be moderating this session today, focused on the impact public interest lawyers have on their rural communities. And before we meet our excellent panelists, I want to mention that for those of you who are interested in serving rural communities in your legal careers, Equal Justice Works partners with Legal Services Corporation every summer to fund students to work at LSC organizations across the country on legal projects that allow students to gain experience and build capacity at the organizations where they serve. This summer, 40 students will be funded to serve those communities, and students earn a $5,000 stipend for their summer of service. So please look out for that application opening in December, and you can also stop by the Equal Justice Works booth to learn more. And now I'm happy to introduce our panelists. So today is my pleasure to welcome Amy Pritchard, Assistant Professor of Clinical Education at the University of Arkansas in Little Rock, Bowen School of Law, Erin Berud, Attorney in Charge at Legal Services of the Hudson Valley, and Michelle Garcia, Staff Attorney at New Mexico Legal Aid. So Amy, can you start by introducing yourself and describing your work?
Sure. My name is Amy Pritchard, and I right now work at the University of Arkansas. I'm a clinical professor, and I run a consumer protection clinic. And then I also work on a program to encourage recent grads to go into rural legal practice and provide them with technical support when they are there. I started practicing in Northwest Arkansas with Legal Aid of Arkansas, and I've worked over the past 10 years with both of the legal aid programs in this state. Arkansas is a pretty rural state, so there's a mix of opportunities here.
Thank you. Erin, can you introduce yourself and talk about your work?
Hi, Brooke. Thank you so much for having us. My name is Erin Berud. I'm the attorney in charge of the Ulster County office at Legal Services of the Hudson Valley, which is located in New York. It takes up a chunk of area between Albany and New York City. So we have 10 offices over 7 counties, and we are the only civil legal service provider that provides comprehensive legal services in our area that we serve. So it's just us. We have way too many cases that, and we do work where there's a basic human need at stake. So housing is a majority of our cases, landlord-tenant issues, and income stabilization. We also have domestic violence work, and foreclosure work and that sort of thing. But really the crux is landlord tenant and income stabilization.
Thank you. And Michelle, can you go ahead and talk about your work and introduce yourself?
Certainly. So my name is Michelle Garcia. I'm a staff attorney with New Mexico Legal Aid, and I also manage our 3 northern offices, as well as our LGBTQ+ legal access program in rural and indigenous communities, which really focuses on civil rights and tribal law. This summer, we were lucky enough to host one of the fellows that you mentioned at the beginning of today's presentation, and I'm just so excited to talk about what rural lawyering looks like in the Southwest.
Well, great. I mean, already it sounds like you do such good work, all 3 of you. But Michelle, let's start with you. Can you just talk about how you got into this line of work and how you ended up in the rural community where you're serving?
Well, I actually am not from New Mexico where I'm working now, and I went to law school down in Louisiana, where I was lucky enough to work for a rural program at Acadiana Legal Services. I always knew that I wanted to be involved with government or public interest work, and I was fortunate enough during law school to get some exposure to this type of public legal services work and doing direct services in rural communities. And I would describe this as a total dream job. I think that the work that happens in rural communities is very impactful in a way that I think is fundamentally different from what plays out in a city environment. And I also think that in rural communities, at least in the Southwest, we have a lot of what are called legal deserts, where there are very few or no attorneys that practice in any county. And what that means is that for those of us that go between place to place to place and ride circuit, if you will, there's the opportunity to get really directly involved with community organizations and work at the individual and systems level to see some change happen. And that's the part that really excites me the most about our work.
That's great. Erin, let's move on to you. How did you find yourself working in a rural community and what interested you in that type of work?
So I am actually from the area where I am practicing now. I grew up in a small town in northern Dutchess County in New York. So it's right across the river from where I am right now. And when I was graduating high school, I could not wait to get out of rural New York. I went to college and law school in Washington, D.C. My dad thinks it's hilarious that I returned to the area just because of how quick I was to leave. But while I was in law school, at first I thought I wanted to stay in Washington or maybe return to New York City or something like that. But I was in a clinic my last year of law school where we were working on consumer protection matters. And, you start to think about, yes, there's poverty and there's need in cities, but the infrastructure and I had never even heard of a legal services corporation near my home. So there are resources available to those in cities that just aren't available to those outside of metropolitan areas. And so when I was thinking about returning, I was like, okay, I'm going to do this. It took me a little while to get to legal services of the Hudson Valley. I did a very brief stint at a bank's foreclosure firm where I was actually lucky enough to have legal service attorneys as my adversaries. And I was like, that's it. That's where I want to be. Those are the people that I want to help. That's the work I want to do. So it took me a little while to get here, but I found where I belong. So I'm very lucky.
It sounds like it. And Amy, how did you get interested in working in a rural community?
Sure. Well, I grew up a couple of hours north of Erin in Vermont and share a very similar story. I went to law school in Seattle, undergrad in law school in Seattle, in the big city. And I always thought I would go back to Vermont, and I graduated in 2009 during the economic collapse, and there was a job in Arkansas. But my first summer, my Rising 2L summer, I think it was a AmeriCorps fellowship, but it was a rural fellowship in Eastern Washington, working with farm workers in Yakima with Northwest Justice Project. And I really enjoyed that work. So when I got ready to graduate and I talked to my mentor about, do I do a federal clerkship or a fellowship or she's like, take a step back and think about what life do you want to live? Where do you want to be? What do you want to do? Not, this path that's prescribed in law school isn't always the path that's going to make folks most happy. And when I was thinking about it, I envisioned myself living on a farm and just going back to Vermont and, having cows and that's ultimately where I've ended up. I live in the country now and work on a lot of rural issues throughout the state. But it was that joy of living in a rural community and having that sense of community, like Michelle mentioned, that really drew me to having my career in a rural community as well.
That's great. Okay, so Erin, I'm going to ask you this question first. What are the needs particular to a rural community and its members that lawyers in these areas can help address or bridge these barriers to justice?
So some of the big, needs that we see in my office are there's really a lack of transportation. for our clients to find us. So even if our clients know that we exist, sometimes it's hard for them to get to us. In the county that I work in, there's a bus system, but if it goes to the outer limits of the county, it's maybe once or twice a day. So oftentimes, you will have clients that, say they need an appointment and you can only meet with them at 1 o'clock, but they have to take the 8 a.m. bus. And so, they're here waiting for you. And so we try to really, do our best to accommodate our clients if we can meet with them outside of the office, or try and work on a bus system, or work on the bus schedule. A lot of times the first time we're meeting our clients is in court, because they cannot get to our office, but they will get down to court if they have to. Another big issue is just lack of technology. Internet is not always the most stable, not always the most updated in our area. So, we are trying really hard in our office to make technology available to our clients. If they have virtual court, we are trying to, meet with them and give our technology to our clients if we can. And really the big thing that my staff work on, and when I was boots on the ground, we're working to educate the rural justices, the judges that are in our courts. A lot of times they're not familiar with the issues that our clients are presenting. So we're attorneys, but we're also educators, and that's something we really focus on here at Legal Services. Is we prepare every case like it's going to trial, going to the highest level, just so that we can be prepared to explain and teach the judges. So those are our three big things here that we deal with.
Thanks. And those do sound very unique to rural communities, and teaching judges probably doesn't sound like something you thought you would be doing when you were in law school. Michelle, how about you? What are some specific needs that you found in the community you work in?
Well, I would co-sign what Erin was just saying about infrastructure. I think that it's really hard to understate how significant a barrier that is in rural communities, because all of the problems that exist in cities, I believe, are compounded by the lack of infrastructure that exists in many rural communities. And for us in the Southwest, that looks like bad roads, extreme weather, a lack of high-speed internet or any internet at all, sometimes a lack of cell service. We have parts of New Mexico where you can't even call 911. And it also means that we have communities that suffer from, the intersection of all of these problems. The office that I began working in for New Mexico Legal Aid in Western New Mexico, in a city called Gallup, over 30% of the residents do not have running water. And it's difficult, I think, for attorneys and judges and court officials to really understand how deep the pockets of rural poverty are that still exist in rural America. And part of that's because our legal profession has traditionally been really a concentrated location where there's a lot of power and privilege and money. And so if you did not grow up in a rural location and familiar with those problems, I think it's very easy to dismiss somebody showing up late to court, or not coming at all, or not responding to things, when really it's not a lack of interest in legal case, at least to my perspective, but rather an inability to get over all of the barriers that exist to actually make it into a courthouse, or make sure that your filings get in, or prepare a defense on your case. And that's where I feel like Legal Services can really jump in and try to both bridge that gap and do some of the judicial education that Erin was talking about. I think that in a big way, Legal Services attorneys are ambassadors, that we really take on that bridging role between the judiciary and being able to talk to, the locations of power and the communities that they are meant to serve, because we are so connected to doing that direct service work. And so I would say that infrastructure is by far the number one barrier that exists for rural clients. And at least out here in the Southwest, I don't think it's a problem that's going to be solved anytime soon, because the COVID-19 pandemic, I think, revealed the deep inequities that existed around things like telelaw and virtual hearings. And it didn't make anything better. It made a lot of things harder, like hand filings went away entirely in our districts, the ability to walk into court and file something. And when you don't have any way to access a court except through high technology, the problem is that we knew even before the pandemic that a lot of people were being left behind in that digital divide. And I think that it will take years to basically make up for the lack of investment that has happened in rural communities, so that eventually we can get things like running water and better roads, and start to address things like how long places are open and whether people are able to access things with low and high tech.
Thank you. And Amy, I see you nodding your head. Do you have anything to add on that?
I mean, I would echo everything that's been said. And I think the other thing that we've seen through the COVID pandemic is both our administrative agencies and our courts really became more and more inaccessible. So our agencies, our unemployment agency and other places where individuals were supposed to get safety net resources, they would have to go in person to a couple of counties over, and we don't have any public transportation here, and then wait to see. So a lot of, it's definitely becoming a more well-known issue after the pandemic, but I don't see investments in changing that at the state level. So there's some of the federal dollars are coming in, but it is an ongoing issue.
And Amy, I'm going to stick with you and ask, what do you think the biggest misconception is when it comes to lawyering in a rural community? What myth would you want to debunk?
Well, I think there are different thoughts on whether you can make a living as a lawyer in a rural community. And there are a lot of ways that people have really fulfilling legal careers in rural communities that aren't always your typical law firm job that everybody kind of thinks is the way that you make a living as a rural lawyer. So I know that, working for an LSC or a public service organization, there's a lot of loan repayment. That's one of the big issues that a lot of folks struggle with in coming out to rural communities, is they've got student loans that they can't afford. So I was able to access a lot of that, and that helped me do public service work. The cost of living is a lot lower. So you really can balance things, but it's not always going to look like what you learn about in law school as being a lawyer. Some folks have to wear different hats, and some folks have to travel long distances to do the work, but it can be very rewarding and very financially secure through several different avenues that folks find.
Michelle, how about you? What's a misconception?
I think people believe that rural communities don't exist. I feel like the misconception that I see is that they are not represented in things like popular media very often. And I think that means we have some very old stereotypes about who lives in rural communities, what a rural community looks like, what a rural community cares about. And they're just a little behind the times. The rural communities that we serve here in New Mexico are majority non-white. I work with many Native American clients, like I said, on the civil rights and tribal law issues. And that's not what people think of when we are picturing rural communities, even in the Southwest. And so I think that there's some misconceptions about what that looks like in modern America. And in terms of, I guess, lawyering, to go to Amy's point, it seems to me like people believe that there's only one way to be a lawyer, and it happens in a big city, and it happens wearing a fancy suit, and it happens going to court every day. And that is just not what I've seen rural lawyering look like in the Southwest. I think it involves a lot more community engagement. I think one of the things that we try to be very proactive about at New Mexico Legal Aid is getting a little bit ahead of people's problems and trying to diagnose things before they completely blow up and result in a new court case. So almost like preventative legal care in that sense. And I also think that the community and relationship building that I think is inherent to rural lawyering really makes a lot of sense when you put it alongside things like travel, like Amy was mentioning. And I do think that an important difference that I've seen in rural lawyering is going from place to place and being able to wear those different hats, to be maybe more formal or more conservative when you're speaking to the judges and doing a little bit of judicial education or trying to bridge those gaps, compared to walking into, community spaces where oftentimes lawyers are seen as outsiders because all of us go to school in the big cities. There aren't law schools in rural communities for the most part. And so that means that even if somebody has grown up in that community, they've had to leave and then come back as an outsider. And I think it's important to remember that lawyers are always passing between those different worlds when we're, talking to the communities and the individuals that we serve versus doing that translation work for the court to explain why the barriers exist or how we're going to be advocating on behalf of a client. And that's something that I think plays out in a very different and unique way in rural communities, because the picture of what a lawyer is doing and what we look like and how we are serving the public is very different than what's happening in a city.
Thank you. And Erin, I'm going to turn it over to you and also ask you a second question because Michelle brought this up. Did you feel like you were an outsider coming back to your community after going away to law school, but then also what the misconception is in your opinion?
Okay, so I'll address that second question first. Yes, in some ways, I really did. If your rural community has a population of lawyers, and a lot of rural communities don't, even here in New York, we have, as I believe Amy mentioned, legal deserts, or about to be legal deserts, where the older populations are all going to retire and they will be left with no lawyers in certain communities. Those who have been here practicing have been here for a long time. So there is you do kind of have to elbow your way back in and show that you are here and why you're here. And especially for those of us who work for legal service corporations or legal aid societies, that our clients deserve the same defense and representation that their clients do. So that's a huge thing. But so a misconception that I actually believed, and then I see a lot of people, is that rural lawyering is boring, or there isn't a need, or you're not going to get the experience that you need to make the living or keep you stimulated professionally or something like that. But it's just not true. The cases that we see here are incredible, and there's so many layers to them. They're like onions. You just keep peeling back. And as Michelle said, we also take like a holistic approach to make sure that we're addressing all the needs of our clients. And if we can make something better before it gets to a certain point, that's really huge. So I feel like we're making a difference, and you see the difference that you're making every day. Whereas I think my counterparts in big cities, maybe in bigger firms, you don't have that gratification of seeing the impact that you're making. So it is exciting and never dull, and can be a little bit exhausting even at times. So.
Great. And my next question was going to focus on what some of the challenges are. And I know we've talked a lot about that throughout the conversation so far. So Michelle, if you don't mind me switching it up, can you talk more about successes, positive things that have happened in your work that make you really happy that you're in this line of work?
Absolutely. I completely agree with what Erin was just saying about the excitement and interest and cool legal work that we get to do in rural communities. One of the previous jobs that I had before coming to New Mexico Legal Aid was working in a violent crimes unit in our biggest city in Albuquerque. And I would say that the work I do at New Mexico Legal Aid is at least as interesting, at least as fulfilling, and at least as complex. And I also think that in rural communities, particularly when they're interjurisdictional, you get the chance to really weave in and out of different, levels of law as well. We go to federal court, we have tribal court and magistrate courts, and all these different levels of complexity and formalism that exist in our court system here in New Mexico. I have colleagues who have taken cases not just to our New Mexico Supreme Court, but also to the Intertribal Supreme Court, the Navajo Supreme Court, and the US Supreme Court. And I don't think that people maybe are having in mind the potential to do this kind of interjurisdictional, really impactful litigation work. But that is absolutely what I've seen happening in rural communities. And I would argue that because of the barriers that exist around infrastructure and transportation, all of the other things that we've mentioned in today's presentation, that also means that we have to be more innovative about the work that we do, because we're operating in deserts where there maybe are not a lot of nonprofit providers or other attorneys to co-counsel with. It means that we have to learn many more areas of law, I think, than our colleagues in the city. And I think that means we also need to have a higher level of cultural competency when it comes to dealing with individuals who are unlike ourselves, or explain to the courts, how they should be dealing with individuals unlike themselves. And so I feel like I get to bring my whole self to work. And I also get the privilege of really being able to work at that high tech and low tech level, at the different levels of complexity. And I don't feel like that is the case in cities. I feel like there is a tendency for people to have a lane and then stay in that lane and have other people do different types of work. And I think it works great in a lot of urban communities. But what I see happening in rural communities is the exact opposite, where you have to have this higher level of competency in many different areas in order to seamlessly move through those different spaces. And so I would say that's a really exciting and innovative part of what rural lawyering brings to the table.
Can I ask you to expand a little bit on the cultural competency? What do you think that entails when it comes to a rural community? And students who might be listening and think, well, do I have that? What does that look like?
Absolutely. So I think it's a lifelong learning journey. I don't think that you can say that you are 100% culturally competent, even within necessarily the culture that you grew up in. You're going to see lots of different flavors. And being in a position that's so public, where you literally speak on behalf of others in public settings like the courtroom, means that I think lawyers are ethically tasked with making sure that we understand where people are coming from in a very literal sense. I'll give you one example. So I've mentioned that I work in tribal courts. In Western New Mexico, where I was working and continue to work, there is a series of cultural taboos around death. And where I went to law school and took classes on things like elder law, you were told, if somebody comes into your office and they are elderly and you are helping them out with a legal problem, you should be asking them about, do you have, end of life directives? Do you have a will? And if you were to take that one size fit all national training and bring it to the small towns in New Mexico where I work, it would totally cut off the conversation. Nobody would be talking to you. It would be incredibly rude, and it would just break whatever trust that you had built with the client to that point. And I think that understanding where you can use national tools that are that one size fit all versus where you need to come up with something that is much more precise to the community that you're serving and the problems that people are seeing on the ground. That's really, I think, the core of this, that you have to be open and willing to make changes to what you think is right. And also maybe put aside the stereotype that, just because you're a lawyer, that you have the loudest voice in the room or the biggest megaphone, and be willing to actively listen to what your clients and community members are telling you. And there are many people who have written much more eloquently on this point than I have. And, I think that the core theme that I think is running through all of those is this concept that attorneys are often paid to talk. And in the world of cultural competency, we have to listen.
That's very helpful. Amy, I'm going to turn it over to you. Any successes that come to mind or any challenges that you think students should know about working in this line of work?
Sure. I think I've had I've been practicing for just over 10 years now throughout the state, and I've had a lot of similar experiences to Michelle, where we've had some great wins at federal court challenging unjust systems and representing rural folks who had never been given a voice at all before. And that's extremely rewarding, but also working with community organizations to help those organizations and groups gain power and meet their goals. So I did some work with in Northwest Arkansas with a community group that also was interested in gardening, and they would invite me to their cultural events, birthday parties and different things. So you really get to see a lot of different communities, get to know a lot of people. And Arkansas has a lot of different communities throughout the state. We have the Arkansas Ozarks, which is where I started practicing. And then I practiced some down in the Delta and some in Southwest Arkansas. And in each one of those, even though I have always personally felt like it's important to be culturally competent, it is a relearning every new community you go into. I'd never lived in the South. And there are just so many things that, yeah, law school doesn't prepare you for that, but it's a great opportunity to really get to know all kinds of different people and learn a lot about. People will sit down and talk to you in a rural community about, they'll be like, what are you doing here? Are you a teacher or a lawyer? Like if you're at lunch or something, and then they'll tell you like the most interesting stuff. It's just a really personally rewarding experience. But then, yes, there are opportunities to make a difference on both individual and then this big scale level that just feel more rewarding. And then if you get bored with something, there's always going to be something different that comes up. So it's, yeah.
That does sound very rewarding. Erin, how about you? Successes and even challenges?
Yeah, before I go to successes, I just want to say I've had the privilege of speaking on a panel with Amy and Michelle before, and I always get so excited to hear their energy and and the work that they do, and especially the program that Amy's involved with. It kind of makes me want to like revisit, start a second career or something like that. But we have a lot of people at our agency that are into working on systemic change, and I think that's really important. But for me, the big successes are kind of the one-on-one, like where you are able to see that you preserve someone's housing and their 3 kids are going to get to stay in their school district with their special services. And, you know, you also assisted with bankruptcy. So now they'll be able to kind of get their finances like revamped and start building credit again, and allows them to kind of move forward for things that many people take for granted. So I think that each small case where you're able to kind of make a difference is really my favorite kind of success. And I know I've mentioned this before, and I'll say it again because it just is so true. In rural communities, a lot of times, you know, parties will go to court unrepresented, and as legal service attorneys, we're able to represent people who wouldn't have had an attorney otherwise. So I know in our community, you know, a legal service attorney walks in and opposing counsel automatically kind of rolls their eyes, or, you know, they get kind of frustrated because they're just going to get them off on a technicality or something. And, you know, we've really trained our staff to say, no, we are going to make sure that our clients are getting the full protection of the law, and you have to do your job. And that frustrates private counsel sometimes. So it's just so rewarding to see that people who would not have had, you know, representation or a fair chance at something will get that. And that's really like the big thing in terms of challenges. You know, I think a lot of times it's opposing counsel. They're not happy to see you, you know, and my comments are really geared towards legal service attorneys, not necessarily, you know, I do hope even if someone's not interested in working at a legal services corporation or a legal aid society, they would still consider rural lawyering, just even in a private firm, because it's so needed. But I just wanted to give that background. My experience is focused on legal services. So.
Great. And I'm glad you mentioned Amy's work at the beginning of what you were saying, because I want to ask Amy more about the Rural Incubator project, talk about some of the outcomes with that and your work around that project.
Sure. In the early 2010s, I guess I don't know how you say that, but there was we had our Access to Justice Commission established, and they started looking at the rural desert issue and all of these retiring attorneys who are leaving rural areas. So our law school developed a program for recent law grads. A lot of students had come to law school wanting to practice in rural areas, but then the messaging that they were getting, or at least hearing, was that you have to stay in the big city for a while, learn how to lawyer, and then you can go home after, or you could go do public interest work after you've gained those skills and that experience. So we developed a program that allowed students to, or recent graduates to receive some funding, technical support, and training. So they're all individuals who are already planning on going back to open their own practices in rural areas. And we help them with the business side of it, and then also the lawyering side of it, because one thing I wanted to mention to I can't remember if it was Erin or Michelle, but like one of the challenges in rural areas, lack of infrastructure, but there's just a lack of resources that you just assume would exist. It's like, oh, we should get you some rental assistance, or we should get, you know, something that like, and then you're looking and looking and looking, and you're like, wait, there are none of those programs here. And so it really is just, how can you make the biggest impact for that individual? But you can't send them to a bunch of partners. So having those, we have Little Rock and urban attorneys supporting these rural practitioners as they start, so they can really tap into their expertise and figure out how to practice in different areas of the law. They get software, and there's a lot of the companies that you work with in law school have programs to support people who want to go out and do either public interest work. So they'll have Westlaw access for a year after you graduate, or different case management software. There's a lot of free stuff available, and we help to bring that to the recent grads as well. And so we've had 7 attorneys come through the program. They are all still continuing in rural practice, but it really does look different, each one of them. Some do, they all wear a bunch of hats. Some do a lot of private practice. One's going to be running for office soon. And that's a huge opportunity that we haven't talked about, but every rural county has a judge, and those judges have to live in that area. And those are some decent paying jobs. So if anyone, you know, for long-term stability, like we have all kinds of counties here in Arkansas where the judges are retiring. After 70, they can't really run again. But so our attorneys they're in this network for 18 months, but then they kind of keep building to make it work for them.
That sounds like an amazing project that should be duplicated everywhere. Michelle or Erin, do you have anything like that going on in your communities, or is it really something that needs to be recreated across the board?
I wish we did. I was just messaging Amy. I mean, I would echo Erin. There's a part of me that just wants to come on down to Arkansas, see how you what the secret sauce is, and how we replicate this in New Mexico and in New York and all these other places, because I know that a lot of the law students I talk to have come from rural communities. They're ex-urban. They're not from the middle of a big city, and they go to law schools, and law school jobs and law school experience is concentrated in cities. And the question of how do we get people back to their hometown, so to speak, I think is a pressing issue in law schools. And I would love for us to have something like this that existed anywhere in the Southwest, because to my knowledge, it does not. And I also know that the states that we're closest to, Texas and Colorado and Arizona, are experiencing exactly the same kind of legal desert problem as New Mexico. And I think that's true in a lot of states in the country. And so if we know the problem exists, I think we're either going to be bold enough to do something about it, or we're going to wait for it to become a total catastrophe. And I don't want that to happen. So, you're going to be hearing from me soon, Amy. I want to know what the secret sauce is.
And there are some states that are really intentional about it as well. I think South Dakota, Kansas maybe, but where the state legislators have realized this is an economic development issue. If you are able to, get people through barriers to employment and stable, all of that resonates through these communities. But so some state legislatures are now looking to invest in rural lawyering the way that they've historically invested in rural doctors, where you go out for a few years and you get some of your loans forgiven, or other incentives like that.
And I have high hopes that maybe we will see something in New York. I have a colleague who was part of the Rural Equal Access to Justice Rural Task Force in New York, and I read the material, and some of the recommendations were ideas like Amy facilitates in her program. So if somebody would read that report and kind of light a fire under someone, maybe we would see it. But it just sounds amazing. And hopefully we will see more of that soon. So.
Absolutely. And with our Rural Summer Legal Corps program, there are members every year that are in law school in another city, in another state, and are happy to come back to their own hometowns for the summer to work with the organization that's serving that community. And so any way to get students and recent graduates and lawyers to the place where they actually want to practice is really important. So on that note, and I will mention before I ask this question, if you listening in, any attendees have questions, please type them in the Pathable chat and I can read them out loud to our panelists. But I'm wondering, what advice do you have for students who want to consider a job or they're really interested in working in a rural community? How can they get started? And how do they get involved with your organization in particular? And Michelle, why don't we start with you?
Well, I'll start by saying we are hiring. We have plenty of open positions in rural communities here in New Mexico, many of which I think are really exciting opportunities for new attorneys or for recent graduates, people who might have just taken the bar. And, I think my advice more generally to law students is that I have too many colleagues now, I think this is my 9th or 10th year in practice, that are considering leaving the profession entirely because they wound up doing legal work that just was not interesting or fulfilling or led to the kind of happiness and joy that they had thought they could get out of a legal career. And I see the exact opposite with my colleagues that work in rural communities, that the work is very nourishing and fulfilling and impactful in a way that I think people don't maybe automatically assume is happening in rural communities. And so if you have an interest in or a passion or a desire maybe to return to your hometown and do the type of rural practice that we've talked about today's panel, I would argue that people should listen to that. Like I said at the beginning, I think I have the best job, ever that I could possibly ask for. And in large part, it's because I get to work directly in rural communities. And I think that it's just a totally different, very unique legal career than what I could have envisioned as a law student, and frankly, much better. And so I would say that people should consider a career. They should consider looking at legal services corporations, and they should consider doing it in a rural community, because I feel like the benefit that we give to society is very high. And I also feel like the personal benefit that we get as the attorneys and the advocates on those cases is really high as well. And so I would say, come and do it. Come and join us. Join me and Amy and Erin and work in rural communities. And I don't think that you will be disappointed.
Such a great endorsement. Erin, what advice would you give?
Apply to be a rural law fellow. Like the program that you administer. We are really hoping to get to host someone this year. We have for the past couple of years, so it's a really great opportunity. You can always reach out to me. I would be more than happy to talk to anyone if that's a career path someone is considering, or maybe Michelle or Amy, I know, are super generous with their time. Sorry to volunteer you, but talk to someone who does it, and get the essence, get what it's really about. It's not just what we were told in law school, this is the path. There are other ways to do things out there, and I think the pandemic has really given us a breaking point. We can neatly say okay, I'm going to take a step back and maybe look at things and do things differently than I thought I had to do them. So I think it's really important. And then also some states have, I know in New York, you're required to do 50 hours of pro bono volunteer work before you can be admitted to the bar. So we are always happy when people want to do their 50 hours with us. We have plenty to do. It's a good way to get involved. It's not a huge commitment if you're not totally sure, but I'm sure other states have the ability to do that. So I think there are a lot of opportunities out there. You might just have to go digging a little bit, but we will always take help. So thank you.
Great advice. To reach out and volunteer, even if it isn't a full-time internship or position. Take people up on that. And Amy, advice for students listening in.
Sure. So like I said, I graduated in 2009. as embarrassing as this is to say now, I didn't really know where Arkansas was. I mean, I kind of knew that it was in somewhere in the center of the country, but there was a job there, and I'd already my dream job in Vermont went away because of funding. So I had already had my whole rural package, like how I wanted to work with these communities and my cover letter, and I could just change it. But I thought I would come to Arkansas for a couple of years, get some experience, and then leave. And really discounted the amazing resources that are available in this state to just have a really great life with just all the natural. Coming from Seattle, where you'd go on a hike and be walking behind 100 people, and here there's just trails everywhere, and it's just a really fulfilling way of life. So then after that, since we were still having the kind of recession, I convinced a lot of my friends to move down for a year and do a fellowship. And so even if you're not making a full lifetime commitment, they could live down here and a lot less and really enjoy, like in the Delta, there's blues clubs, there's all, it's just a fun place to live, all kinds of festivals that you can actually afford. And like there's space to, I mean, I don't go to festivals now because of the pandemic, but before that I did a lot of festivals and things that just really had that small town feel. So I would convince anybody, even if you don't know where Arkansas is or don't really look at opportunities, and just give it a chance and see what works for you.
Great advice. And we have some questions coming in from attendees. I'm going to read this one from Alexandra. How do you address the gap in access to services and other aid in rural areas? Are you ever able to coordinate services for your clients? And if not, do you think that's a systematic barrier you can effectively work across, or might it ever change? And whoever wants to start in addressing that question.
I mean, so part of the community that Michelle was talking about is really getting out there and becoming partners with the other communities, agencies that provide services. And, at least where we are, we don't have enough, but there are agencies. So, we really make sure that we are, we're sitting at the table when all of the human service organizations are meeting. They know they can call us. We will, find ourselves sitting in the waiting room of DSS sometimes to make sure that our clients are getting the appropriate things. We just, as part of a holistic approach, we just really make ourselves familiar with what is available, and we work it to the best of our ability and get our clients what they need or what we can get them. It may not satisfy everything, but we can always use more services, and hopefully over time the amount of services will grow in rural areas. Probably in maybe where Michelle works or Amy, there might be less, but we are lucky in New York. We do have a number of services.
I mean, I would say that's probably true. We definitely have parts of New Mexico where we don't even have basic emergency services, or like I said earlier, roads and running water. And the lack of infrastructure is really extreme. I think that where attorneys can make a difference is that sometimes we get access to conversations merely by virtue of being attorneys. We get a seat at the table because of our profession, because of our legal training, and because we're respected in communities. And I think how we use that platform is a big piece of ethically how we move through rural communities and figure out, are we going to use the megaphone that we get to try to connect some of these pieces together to make sure that people are not so siloed with different community organizations. I think where there's a lack of infrastructure, there's often also a lack of communication, because communication is harder, because it's, tricky to get from one side of town to the other when there's no public transportation, all the other things that we spoke about earlier in the panel. And so where lawyers can make a difference is that, we have access to the courts and to all this kind of behind the scenes justice information. We get a seat at the table. We have offices, to email people and phones. And we're usually the I guess the richest, most well-connected organization in that community has been my experience, that we don't have a lot of other, nonprofits that are maybe as big or as well-funded. And so where I think we can institutionally make a difference is in bridging those gaps that I talked about earlier with the courts to make sure that, smaller community organizations and nonprofits are connected with the justice system in general, that we are, applying for grants, that we're helping with technical assistance and answering organizational questions, which we do quite a lot of at New Mexico Legal Aid, particularly in the field of violence, so that organizations feel like when they do have an emergency, that they feel like they need an attorney to answer, they can pick up the phone and call us. And I think that accessibility is just as important as what we do for individuals at the client level. And so that's how we have started to work around, I think, some of those issues in New Mexico. We also have some programs during the pandemic that looked at much more low-tech ways for people to access the courts. I have clients that I've been pen paling with by letter in a PO box for months now. And I also have clients that we were able to distribute phones through some, unusual federal funding so that they could call into court and actually appear at their hearings. And I think to maybe just emphasize a point that I made earlier, I think it's going to require both high and low tech solutions to think about these wraparound services and providing holistic care. It can't be just one or the other.
That's all really interesting. I think we have time for one more question. This is from Ella Russell, who is actually a Rural Summer Legal Corps Fellow, not this past summer, but the summer before. Her question is, what are some common community partners and organizations in rural areas that offer safe meeting spaces for rural clients? Any thoughts on that?
I will say, and that's one of the things that the legal aid programs in Arkansas have been really good about, is building these community partnerships. So we have medical legal partnerships, school partnerships, working with United Ways. So I think there are a lot of natural partners if you think outside of the lawyer, legal, just courts. But then also libraries. Rural libraries are a great source of meeting space and also technology and different. That is something that we have really strong resources in here in Arkansas. So we've both the law school and legal aid programs have partnered with local libraries as well.
I would second the libraries and say that sometimes we don't have meeting spaces. Sometimes it's the client driving halfway and me driving halfway and we're meeting on the side of a field. And so that means that we have definitely developed trainings that require no technology whatsoever, that we can do with a whiteboard and a marker in a field, because we don't always have, the infrastructure of a physical meeting space that is, safe and culturally appropriate and makes sense for our clients and all of that. And as I mentioned earlier, we have extreme weather in the Southwest too. And so even if we have a really great location in town, that doesn't mean that it's going to be equally accessible, during the entirety of the year, where people may not be able to get in due to snow or ice or big storms that are happening. And so I would say it goes back to that flexibility. I would love to say that we have more, and we definitely have some of the same spaces that Amy was talking about. But sometimes I think the flexibility is recognizing that we're going to have to get in a car and meet a client halfway.
Yeah, ditto to libraries. And a lot of our, domestic violence providers will provide space for us, or community centers and that sort of thing. But we frequently, if a client, sometimes we're able to pay cab fare to get a client here to us or to court if it's imperative. But a lot of times we will get in the car and drive to the client. And during COVID, that has become harder. It's made a lot of outside meetings if necessary, but prior to that, gas stations, diners, that sort of thing. So we get innovative sometimes, but.
Well, those are all great to know. I mean, I love the fact that there are some safe spaces, but that you make them if you can't find them. And thank you to those students who did ask questions. We are nearing the end of our time. So thank you so much to our panelists for participating. We hope that you enjoyed it. I know that I did. I do want to thank Legal Services Corporation for partnering with us on the Rural Summer Legal Corps. Again, if you're interested in participating in that program, the application will be available in December, and it's possible that All three of our panelists here today might be involved in some way, shape, or form in your fellowship. The recording of this session will be available to all of you to listen to later today, and then you can also access it by coming back to this page in Pathable. We also want to thank our conference sponsor, Idealist, for helping make this year's 2021 Conference and Career Fair possible. Today at 4:30 Eastern, we will be hosting a panel with Bradley Butz, a Director of Business Development at Idealist, and you can learn how to use Idealist to find your dream public interest job. If you have any questions about this year's fair or how Equal Justice Works can help you launch your public interest career, come speak with one of our representatives from 12 to 6 p.m. Eastern today. You can find us by searching for Equal Justice Works on the Organizations tab. Thank you again to our panelists. We're so thrilled to have you, and I hope everybody has a great rest of their day.
You too. Thank you all.